Okay, is everybody here who needs to be here? And by that I mean, does anybody know of anybody who should be here but isn't? No?
We're
Okay.
good.
Okay, so unless I'm mistaken, we are at the point of summations, and the plaintiff may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor, and correction rules leftover time is reserved for rebuttal.
That's fine.
May it please the court. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury. The defendant was reckless and careless. Today you heard the story of Damien Kozak, the defendant, how he made reckless, careless, and negligent decisions that resulted in a fatal attack. The hit TV show, Midlands After Dark with Alex Grace, wanted to have a cute, cuddly chimpanzee on its summer show alongside its trainer. But instead, on June 29, 2017, they received a vicious animal with an incompetent trainer. And little did MTS know, that animal wasn't even trained. The defendant had chosen an animal that was unsuitable to be on TV shows. He had failed to train it, and he was not safe that day on set. And because of that, his animal during the rehearsal stood up and charged at nearby rider Chris Wilfana, knocking him down, beating him and biting him until he was laying in a pool of his own blood. Now it's because of the defendant's actions and choices that we, the plaintiff, is suing him today for negligence. Now to prove liability of negligence, there are 4 elements: duty, breach of duty, causation, and damages. And today the defense has already agreed the defendant owed a duty: provide a trained animal and take reasonable steps to ensure safety. And the defense has also agreed that MTS suffered harm in the cancellation of their show, and that was a direct result of the attack. So we have to prove to you today that the defendant breached his duty, and that's what caused the attack to happen. And now there's 2 types of causes we had to prove to you: direct and proximate cause. Direct cause means, but for the defendant's actions, the attack would have never happened. If the defendant had chosen a safer animal, had trained it, and just had been simply safe that day, Chris Wilfana would still be alive. Proximate cause talks about what was the foreseeable consequence. That is, asking, would a reasonable animal trainer, would a reasonable person think that with an unsafe and aggressive animal, with no training and general lack of safety, that something could have gone wrong? Somebody could have gotten hurt? The answer is yes. We prove these things to you today by the preponderance of the evidence. And that just means a little more likely than not. It means we just had to prove things to you by 51, just 1% more. And the defense also carries that same burden. But when you go to the deliberation room, you'll see that the evidence is clearly showing that the defendant is more liable than not. Now let me explain how we prove that to you. Let's first talk about the chimpanzee Elias. Simply put, Elias should have never been on that stage. Dr. Hawkins, an expert in primatology, explained to you that he could not fulfill a single category for an ideal subject, especially when it came to aggressive behavior. Because Elias had been aggressive on TV shows in the past, in 2015. And after this aggressive incident, did the defendant reevaluate anything? No. He did not look to his subject, who was getting older, more likely to be aggressive and stronger, and change it. He didn't look to his safety guidelines, which he claimed was the reason that this aggressive act happened, and he didn't update them. And he didn't look at his training. The first time, he failed to complete it, and he continued that again. He did finish training on a second time, on June 29th. And he knew the risks, but he couldn't afford to care, because his animal sanctuary was going under. You saw his financial statements. He only had $5,000 in his account and a month left. Being on Midlands After Dark with the best possible show was going to save it. But that made him cut corners in training. Because he wanted the best act possible, he decided to use hand signals to train Elias. He had used verbal signals in the past, hundreds of hours of training and years of experience. But for hand signals, he only had 8 hours of training. Not only was this a radical new way to train a chimpanzee, but he didn't finish that training. Dr. Hopkins explains to you how there is a crucial transition that needs to be made, and the defendant did not do that on the 2 occasions his chimpanzee was aggressive. Hunter Cooper told you that after the attack, the defendant said he should have made that switch. Jamison Clark saw how the training wasn't working. She visited the sanctuary, and when the animal was supposed to shake his head, it instead ran for his trainer. Ashley Thornhill told you the defendant said Elias wasn't ready yet, and that was just days before the rehearsal. That animal was not trained. Let's talk about what actually happened on June 29th. Well, when they arrived on set, the animal was acting aggressive in the morning. Several witnesses heard it scream. Not only was it aggressive, it was acting violent. Hunter Cooper explained that sometime between the defendant arriving on set and walking on stage, he had his left arm bandaged. And you heard the defendant was treated for an animal bite that required 18 stitches. His animal had acted violently, had bitten him, and he brought him on that stage anyway. Not only did he bring that violent animal on stage, but he puts everybody in a position of danger, literally. He decided to stand 20 feet away and behind a group of riders, knowing full well that everybody would be in the crossfire. So let's break down what actually happened during that rehearsal. The defendant walks on stage with his animal and says it's closest to the show's host. They do a few tricks, but eventually the defendant stands up and he walks, not just off stage, but 20 feet away and behind a group of riders. They moved closer to him. His animal starts acting up quickly because it was already in an aggressive state. And the defendant tries to calm him down, but because he didn't finish his training, there is no way to. And because Chris Villafana is sitting in front of him, that chimp charges at Chris Villafana, attacks Chris Villafana, knocks Chris Villafana down, beats Chris Villafana, and kills Chris Villafana. Your Honor, opposing counsel, it is clear that the decisions leading up to that attack by the defendant were reckless and careless. The defendant knew that because at the funeral of Chris Villafana, he went up to the widow and he said that he shouldn't have been standing that far away, especially with something so new with Elias. He knew that he didn't complete his training and that he wasn't reasonably safe. It is clear that he was reckless and careless that day. You must find him liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense summation.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were waiting for me. Go ahead.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury. Guidelines are rules. Things go wrong when they aren't followed. Now, Elias had performed on 18 other shows with 18 different studios. And Mr. Kozak had sent the same set of guidelines, safety guidelines, to all 19 studios. But I only want to talk about the one studio that was different. I want to talk about the other life lost that day. Now let's walk through June 29th and see exactly how Midland's Television Studios broke 4 out of the 15 guidelines, which led to 2 deaths on June 29th, 2017. Now on that day, Mr. Kozak and Elias had showed up to Midland's Television Studios ready to perform. They had worked tirelessly for many hours to ensure that Elias was trained. Now Elias has been in the care of Danny for 4 years. And during that time, they were training for 4 years. Elias had been invited to perform on 18 other shows. And since those 18 other shows where everything went great, they had only had time to improve on their training. Now they had set with Midland's Television Studios a set of safety guidelines to ensure the safety of everyone that would be on set that day. Mr. Kozak and Elias were ready to perform, ready to show the world how amazing Elias was. But little did they know that when they walked onto set that day, only one of them would walk away alive. Now, before the day of the taping, Mr. Kozak had trained Elias to do the same tricks that he already knew, but through hand signals instead of voice commands. Well, Dr. Hawkins informed us how Elias was not a good choice in a performance chimpanzee. But Elias's demographics never changed throughout the 18 performances. Elias had been through puberty from the start of beating Mr. Kozak throughout all 19 performances. His gender never changed throughout those performances. Dr. Hawkins also informed us how on safari trip, where a guideline was broken, Elias had a startle reaction. Dr. Hawkins also informed us how a startle reaction does not necessarily mean that the chimpanzee will choose to fight. Instead, Elias had perceived a threat of a broken guideline and chose to fight. Now, Dr. Hawkins also informed us something that I want to make sure that I got right. Dr. Hawkins told us that after Elias had exhibited a startle reaction, there were a number of environmental stimuli that the guidelines were controlling for that could have caused the attack on that day. A number of guidelines. Now let's go through these guidelines. Guideline number 15. So to make sure everyone has read this handout. Well, Ms. Thornhill informed us today how she found the stack of guidelines that Mr. Kozak had personally brought to make sure that everyone read these handouts was found in Mrs. Grace's dressing room, undistributed. We heard from Mr. McClellan how he was not pestered by interns or other employees to make sure that he read these guidelines, that he was not made sure that he knew what was happening in regards to these guidelines. We also heard from Ms. Cooper, who was not supposed to be on set, that she did not receive these guidelines. Midlands Television Studios did not have enough security to control for someone who had a restraining order on their host and keep that person off the set. So how could they control for everyone reading these guidelines? And this was not known to Mr. Kozak till after the incident, till today in court. Guideline number 15 was violated. Now, guideline number 2. Smell food is confusing for Elias. We have heard from many people today that there was food on set. Mr. McClellan told us exactly how that food was on set and that the writers were raving about chicken wings. We heard from Ms. Cooper how this food was on set and that Mr. Kozak had asked them to move the food. And Mr. Kozak asked them to move the food because he knew this was a violation of his guidelines. But he did not know till after the incident that the food was moved closer to Elias in an even worse position. Guideline number 2 was violated. Now, guideline number 4, to give us time to settle in. Mr. Kozak walked onto that set that day and was not given a schedule. He was not told what was going to happen, when it was going to happen. He was just told what he was told, that there was going to be a rehearsal. He thought that was the time you get to acclimate, but others were there. Guideline number 4 was violated. And lastly, guideline number 13, do not egg on Elias. We have heard from 3 witnesses today, Mr. Kozak, Mr. McClellan, and Ms. Cooper, how when Elias was exhibiting a startle reaction, Ms. Grace reached towards a screaming, jumping chimpanzee. And the chimpanzee leapt. Members of the jury, it was not just one guideline that frustrated Elias. As more and more of these guidelines were violated, Elias got more frustrated. He couldn't handle so many violated guidelines. And at the crucial time of when he was exhibiting a startle reaction, Ms. Grace did not only violate a guideline, but violated common sense and reached towards an agitated chimpanzee. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, opposing counsel wants to believe that Mr. Kozak was reckless and careless. Mr. Kozak did not know that these guidelines were being violated. He actively tried to stop these guidelines from being activated when he tried to get the food moved. He even brought his own set of guidelines to distribute to everyone. But it was not done by Midland's Television Studios. They did not follow through. They were the ones that were reckless. They were the ones that were careless to listen to Mr. Gonzaga. Now today we heard a case regarding negligence. Specifically, who breached their duty of negligence. Now, a duty can be breached by both direct and proximate causation. Say there's a driver driving down the road, and they ignore the lines painted along the road. They swerve out and accidentally hit someone. But for the driver's decision to ignore the painted lines, the accident would not have happened. And it is reasonably foreseen that ignoring the painted lines would cause this accident. Now today, the driver is Midland's Television Studios, and the guidelines are the lines painted on the road. But for Midland's Television Studios not following these safety guidelines, we simply would not be here today. But for Midland's Television Studios not following these safety guidelines, both Chris and Elias would be alive. But for Midland's Television Studios not following these safety guidelines, neither party here today would be suffering. And Mr. Kozak reasonably foresaw that Midland's Television Studios would trust him. He had reasonably foreseen that Midland's Television Studios would follow the safety guidelines that he sent. The same set of guidelines for all 18 performances to ensure the safety of everyone on set. He had reasonably foreseen that Elias would be in a safe environment, just like the last 18 performances. The guidelines were the only thing protecting both Chris, Viafana, and Elias on that day. Members of the jury, guidelines are rules. Things go wrong when they aren't followed. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Rebuttal.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Your Honor, members of the jury, unclear, vague, and outdated guidelines are not rules, but standards in subject selection, training, and safety are. And when they were broken, things did go wrong. You see, opposing counsel talked about a lot of rules, and let's talk about them. They mentioned food, which if you look at Exhibit 23, doesn't actually say don't have food on set. It just says brush your teeth and wash your hands. This rule was not violated. They also talked about acclimation and how there wasn't time provided, but you heard the defendant was having phone conversations before the rehearsal. They also talked about not sending out guidelines to everybody, ensuring they read it. But you also heard how the defendant did not hold a safety meeting to explain everything, to also make sure everyone read the guidelines. And during that safety meeting, Jameson Clark couldn't answer questions, and she couldn't make the right decisions because she had no way of knowing what was appropriate or not. That means she had no foreseeable consequence of what would happen if there was food on set. Most importantly, don't egg Elias on. A vague guideline that doesn't actually say don't touch Elias or what to do during a stellar reaction. But he did violate his training and the safety, so you must find the defendant liable of negligence. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. I think this concludes it, does it not? Okay. Nice job, everybody. Thank you. You'll indulge it, Ms. Harrison and I need to finish up our paperwork, so do whatever you need to do, I'm not disturbing us.